My name is Monique Lucier. I'm a reader in public health and well-being at Northumbria University. And for those who don't know her yet, this is my colleague Sonia Dalkin. We both come from Northumbria University and have worked together for a few years now, apart from an interlude where Sonia was very, very fortunate to come and work at Leeds University with our colleagues here. But the point I'm making is that throughout the times that we've worked together, all our projects have had some realist core to them. And so we've taken this presentation really as an opportunity to reflect back on the metaphors, going back to this morning, drawing sketches that have enabled us to understand realist thinking and then help us share that with our practice partners, our colleagues, our students, to help them engage in it. So this presentation is about sharing that with you and perhaps less conventionally gather your views and ideas at the end of the presentation. So I'll begin by giving a bigger background on what led us to believe that thinking about how we represent realist thinking is important, and then Sonia will take over and talk us through some representations themselves. It works. This is of course the iconic statement that needs no introduction in this room, so I'll pass very briefly. But this very brilliantly simple equation is really obviously underpinned by a complexity of thought that many of us have found easier to explain through metaphors. Well, we're going to try and have a show of hands and see who recognises what metaphor, but I'll not go through that. But one that particularly spoke to me a few years ago is one by Jill Westthorpe that I've used unashamedly several times since, but always acknowledging that it was yours. Thank you. And it's the one of the tennis ball and how it reacts differently in different contexts, if it's on Earth, in space or in the water. These metaphors, I think, are invaluable in helping us explain realist thinking. They're really useful. One of the things they don't do, though, is include human agents and their emotions and volitions and what that does in a social programme. So yes, unfortunately, many of us human beings are a bit less predictable than a potato plunged in boiling water. But perhaps the key difference between that is of course what's always been referred to as reasoning. And whilst that makes sense to most of us, our experience tells us that often reasoning is overlooked when people are formulating complex context mechanism outcome configurations. But as I say, it's always been there. Ray Pawson and Anna Manzano reiterated in 2002 what was in the 1997 book already about the fact that mechanisms capture the many different ways in which the resources on offer may impinge on the stakeholders' reasoning. Weiss talks about how program theories deal with the mechanisms that intervene between the delivery of a program and the outcomes, and it focuses on participants' responses, which include the reasoning, obviously. And as recently as last week, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it already, but Le Couture et al. Published an article in Implementation Science where they did a scoping review of all the users of mechanisms. A very good article. And they came up with this definition of mechanism. A mechanism is hidden but real. It is an element of reasoning and reactions of agents in regard to the resources available in a given context to bring about changes through the implementation of intervention, etc., etc. So taking this into account, we've come up in a recent paper with a new CMO statement, which has nothing new, just highlights something different, which says that intervention resources are introduced in a context in a way that enhances a change in reasoning, and this alters the behaviour of participant, which leads to outcome. So this, obviously, as I say, is nothing new, but it makes explicit the idea of reasoning and encourages colleagues to think beyond intervention activities and resources when they think about mechanisms. This is associated with a figure which Sonia will cover in a minute. And to refer to Jill's idea this morning about system and ladders, perhaps to go up a rung on the system ladder, we might want to replace the reasoning by forces or structures, etc. But perhaps that's something that we might go back to at the end. But with giving a stronger prominence to reasoning comes the issue of how reasoning gets activated. Many times in the literature, it's been said that mechanisms get fired or triggered in context, given the right resources, as if it was, and I apologise for using yet another metaphor, but as if it was an on and off switch, so mechanisms are either on or they're off. But actually, when we involve human beings and emotions, etc., it might look more like a dimmer switch. So a dimmer switch can be switched off, and then we might want a very ambience kind of light, very low light, or we might want to read and have a very, very bright light, and that we felt perhaps explains a little bit better how reasoning comes on a continuum rather than being switched on or switched off. And exposing these ideas to our colleagues has led to two kinds of resources, two kinds of comments. And one of them has been that, well, of course, it's always been on the continuum, which is, of course, absolutely right. And the other one being, that's really helping us to think about how we operationalize the thinking. So we took solace in the second one and tried to persevere, but always, of course, with the acknowledgement that this idea of shifting, of continuum, of progression, of going up to a sort of a tipping point in the balance till the reasoning changes the outcome, has always been there 18 years ago. That's exactly what Paulson and Thiele said. So for years, the realist community has tried to represent all of the complexity of thinking in a succinct way that yet acknowledges the complexity of thinking. And this is what we've been trying to do in trying to go to conferences. All these are opportunities to present our thinking and clarify our idea and engage other people. And so we've been trying for some time to come up with a diagram that's complex enough to stay true to the thinking, but yet simple enough to engage our colleagues in it. So Sonia will talk you now through that journey a bit from ourselves, but from other people's perspective.
Good afternoon, everybody. So this morning when Nick Emmel opened, he said, one of his slides said, reflecting backwards to take us into the future of realist methodologies. So that's a little bit of what we're going to do today. So we're going to reflect back on our images and figures that we've used to present mechanisms and context mechanism outcome configurations. So going right back to the start, we looked at Paulson and Thiele. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with this diagram. And it aims to show the basic ingredients of realist methods. However, we feel that the casual reader or the novice looking at this diagram would see mechanisms and may speed read past the resource and reasoning element that accompanies this diagram. However, the idea that regularity is on a continuum was something that really struck us when looking back at this diagram. So moving to the next diagram, this is sort of a tour through our scrapbook. So please don't judge us. But this was a figure that was used on a poster on personalised care planning, so this was quite a while ago. So you can see that, looking back at it, we thought it was far too generic and far too simple, and that there was no acknowledgement of reasoning within it. But the strength of it was that the implementation pathway was within the context, and it also kept an idea of continuums through the knowledge translation arrow. So moving on, and having probably read Paulson and Thiele for a second time, we came up with this diagram a few years ago. So this diagram distinguishes between the input of an intervention and the mechanism. So we were advancing our thinking a little bit more. However, there's still no continuum of mechanisms, and the shape used in this diagram sort of enhances that idea that mechanisms trigger or fire in a context and happen very suddenly. Which can sometimes not be that helpful, and there's no explicit resource in reasoning. Then we get to probably our favourite one, looking back, the most advanced until our most recent one. The strength of this was that it identified a variety of outcomes. So you can see there's proximal, distal, intended and unintended. And sometimes potentially that's missed when first using realist methods. And it's also very important to understand those unintended consequences. Also, the mechanisms and the outcomes are within the context in this diagram, and it's showing a clear interaction. However, it doesn't drill into the separate components of mechanism, and it doesn't show reasoning as being on a continuum. So now we did a quick Google search. This wasn't a systematic search, so please don't jump in if we've missed anyone's diagram who's in the audience. But we just looked at a few of the diagrams that came up. So the first one is from a PhD thesis by Gregory Hill. And this depicts mechanisms as a process and on a continuum. But it doesn't disaggregate resource and reasoning, and it doesn't highlight how mechanisms interact with the context. The next one comes from Justin Yagosh, and it's linked context, mechanism and outcome configuration chains depicting the ripple effect, which shows how the outcome of one CMOC configuration can become the context of the next. It also situates the intervention within the context. There's then the Ramesses diagram. So the Ramesses diagram disaggregates very clearly resources and reasoning, and it also uses the phrase patterns of outcomes, which we thought was really helpful in understanding that outcomes are in terms of a pattern and aren't final. There isn't one final outcome, and there can be irregularities. Then we turn to Batteram et al., who use CIMO, context intervention mechanism outcome. So this includes the intervention in the formula, which can help people to not conflate intervention with mechanism. And it also acknowledges levels of the system. So you can see there's the organisational level, the practitioner and the client. So through looking through our own diagrams and others, we highlighted three main issues. The first was deciding whether aspects within an intervention implementation process in a realist project contribute mechanistically or contextually in the overall explanatory endeavour. The second issue highlighted was that it was also important not to conflate intervention strategy with mechanism. And the final issue was that although the distinction between resources and reasoning is very clear in Pawson and Tilley's work, it can be missed in subsequent writings. And sometimes either resource or reasoning can be used at the expense of another under the same mechanism banner. Therefore, we came up with this diagram to try and overcome some of these issues and to mainly try and operationalise realist methods. So I'd like to mention, obviously, that this is at the stakeholder reasoning, so we are at the bottom of the ladder, to use Jill's analogy from this morning. In our study, through using this formula, it became clearer whether data contributed contextually or mechanistically, and we could identify mechanism components, resource and reasoning, which then look different to contexts. Also, the explicit use of resource and reasoning would hopefully avoid the mechanism being conflated with the intervention. And also, the explicit use of resource and reasoning would mean that hopefully one isn't favoured in place of the other. However, after looking at our own diagram again, we've now decided that we're not very happy with it, and we'd like to improve it again. So, as with realist methods, there are no final truths, so we would like to advance this even more. So, first of all, to begin with, we added the idea of CMOC chains, so taken from Justin's ideas, and highlighted the outcome. We highlighted the outcome with a dotted line to show that the outcome of one CMO can become the context of another. We then changed the reasoning. One of the main issues in our paper was that reasoning was never depicted as being on a continuum, and we thought that could be represented a lot more clearly in our diagram. We then changed the outcome to outcome patterns. We preferred the term regularity used in Pawson and Tilley and the term patterns of outcomes used by Ramesses, but we decided to go for outcome patterns to stick with the CMO, and because patterns of outcomes wouldn't fit in the box. So, from the jigsaw diagram that we saw from Northumbria University, we liked the idea of including different types of outcomes, so proximal, distal, intended, unintended. So we added those in. And then we thought, why stop there when context can also be proximal and distal, and added in a final large circle to incorporate that all. And we felt that this better reflected the idea of systems and layers of systems. We also today thought about advancing the model even more, after talking to Justin about the permeability of context and mechanism and outcome, and maybe it should be that the proximal context should have dotted lines to show their interactions with the distal contexts. So, we've purposefully done this as a shorter presentation, or at least we thought it was, but I've just seen that we've got about 2 minutes left. So we'd like to know your comments on the figure. Do people agree that representing realist thinking helps understanding? Any idea on how, we could improve the model further? We also would like to know if, in amending the figure further, we're moving too far away from the succinctness of Pawson and Tilley's original diagram. And also, doing this presentation threw up for us whether we should disaggregate between programme activities and opportunities and resources. So in turning things on their head, we would like to ask you these questions instead of you asking us questions. So please, we'd invite for any comments now.
I'd just like to say I'm full of admiration, and every one of those diagrams had something to say. But I just want to reveal some of the past history here. In calling them CMO configurations and using the rugby ball diagram as we called it, we even agonised about that. So we agonised about whether the mechanism arrow should touch the contextual ring, and argued for months about whether that should be so. We also argued about what we should call the bloody thing. I wanted to call it a mechanism context outcome configuration. Nick insisted on CMOX because you could say it more swiftly. But I think the point was and if you look in the good old book, you'll find a much more complicated diagram where the CMOCs move, which nobody ever reproduces. So basically, what I'd like to say is that it is your job to adapt them to the job in hand, and they seem to do very, very adequate jobs for certain types of evaluation. So the CMO configuration was only intended as a sort of shorthand. I call it an aid memoir, and it was intended to do exactly what you're doing here. So brava.
Sarah van Belle from the Institute of Tropical Medicine. In trying to apply this also in a PhD thesis, I would like to argue to open up the black box of reasoning. What I found difficult with CMOs was how to distinguish between different groups of actors, their practices, and somehow reasoning and resources obfuscates this social action element. And I would like to ask you how this relates to structure agency, the structure agency debate that is key to sociology and so on.
I think I'd quite like to find a model where we can swap the reasoning bit for structures or actions or, local cultures kind of thing. I think it's important to disaggregate still. One of the issues we've had over the year, both in explaining and engaging and trying to get students to think about this, is to really disaggregate between the resources and the reasoning, so that you clearly see what's being input into a context that might trigger some kind of change that might lead to visible outcomes. So ideally, and again, I don't know whether this is it, but ideally, I'd quite like to have a box that's interchangeable, and so that the black box is the little cloud, and it goes on a continuum kind of thing of activation, and then, but I don't know whether that would work or not.
I think in looking in any of those sort of boxes, in looking in any of those boxes, you could go further and open them up, but it is a bit like Pandora's box. So, you know, if we do go into reasoning, there would be so much to go into, the same as if we went into context or into different kinds of resources and where do resources sit. So I think it is something that we're thinking about doing in the future, but it's finding the time as well. So at the moment we're looking at the overall, but I think that would be something really interesting to look into further about different reasonings and how they interact.
Yeah, especially for large-scale interventions.
Yeah.
And I think also, this is for me picking up a bit, on Anna's idea about the marketing tool and you know, the CMO being a shorthand for thinking. It's been a fantastic shorthand, a fantastic marketing tool because people have really taken it on, but sometimes they've misunderstood it. So this, to me, is about trying to improve the marketing tool, not changing the underpinning ideas, but actually just marketing it in a way that makes it easier to engage with. So, but reaching the right balance between having something that's readable, not overly complex, and something that's engaging is perhaps the challenge we have.
Thank you. Mike Kelly from the University of Cambridge. I'd like to follow up that last point, because I too had been wondering about how structuration theory fits with all of this. And I wonder whether it's important to distinguish between, or to ask the question, whether what you're developing here is beginning to sound a bit like a general social theory of human action, rather than a guide to disentangling the complexities of evaluating within complex systems. Now, of course, you could argue that you can't do that complex evaluation without a general social theory. And in fact, one could go further and argue many of the limitations of what pass as evaluations are limitations precisely because they lack a broad understanding of social theory. So I think there's some scope here to think about a couple of three issues from structuration theory. One is as you yourselves mentioned a little while ago, unintended consequences. Because central to Giddens' arguments in the books in the early 80s were the unintended consequences of social action arising from the structure-agency interchange. Secondly, the recursive nature of social practices, which is a phrase that the previous questioner used. The recursive nature of social practices and how they become embedded within social systems, and trying to unravel the nature of the real connections or the mechanisms within these things requires an understanding of that. So perhaps my wonderment or wondering has turned into a sort of push towards you to say, well, you know, you need in a sense to go whole hog here and begin to think about the ways in which those developments in British social theory of a couple of decades ago fit with this. Perhaps more explicitly than has been done hitherto. It'd certainly be quite a profitable thing to do, given all the interest in a range of fields about how you deal with complex systems and complex interventions in complex systems, which is, you know, at the moment largely in the hands of either psychologists or a sort of derivative group from the Cochrane collaboration. And it might be well worth injecting a bit more sound sociology into this in the way that you seem to be beginning to develop. So not really a question, it's a bit of a ramble.
Just saying, it is something that's been put together in a really short period of time, and that's why we were really pleased to be able to do it here, to get the comments off everybody and to sort of have the expert input. And I think that's something that we'll definitely consider if we take this further in really, as you say, going whole hog and looking at it with a much more precise lens and taking that further.
Vicky wanted to say something, and then maybe we can do the transition while we're having the last question. Is that all right, Justin?
Yeah, Vicky Ward from the University of Leeds. It wasn't a question so much as an idea for you. The thing that's really struck me from what you've been showing is, and from what everybody's been talking about, is a huge use of metaphor. So we've seen loads of pictures of light switches and dimmer switches and all sorts of things. And what it strikes me from your diagram is that I'm feeling that you're really constrained by your ability to actually draw some of those ideas. So it's really quite basic stuff. But I was wondering if you considered working with an illustrator or perhaps somebody who does data visualization to actually try and get some of those concepts and ideas that are in your head out onto paper. And also I think it works as a brilliant marketing tool, because then there are metaphors and things that I think all of us warm to and make sense to a lot more people, rather than kind of different bits of diagrams that you've got to explain and describe. So it's just an idea.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons for initially making the diagram was because we understood the metaphors were so useful to us, and we felt like they were really good at explaining and helping our understanding. But yet, unfortunately, it's quite hard to fit your project into the metaphor, and also at the same time you can't start talking about tennis balls and potatoes in a publication. So using this was sort of a halfway house. So it helped us to operationalise the method and also to convey that to other people. But I think your idea of having an illustrator would be really helpful to get some of those ideas and make it a lot more exciting and to speak to a different audience. I really like, have you seen the King's Fund images that are drawn? I mean, it wouldn't be anything like that, but I think it would really help to advance the idea even more, so I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
It's a 10-second one. Beware this word metaphor, because mechanisms are not metaphors, they're real.
Yeah.
The tennis ball really does fall because the forces that are existing are real. So I just want to, I like the diagram incidentally, and I think we can keep developing them, but I just think we need to avoid slipping into thinking of mechanisms as metaphors rather than metaphors as ways of helping us understand real causal processes.
Yeah.
Forces. Whatever's that Justin's about to.